Over the course of nearly 600 years, Spain has been involved in numerous wars with beneficial and disastrous results. At one point, they were one of the largest and richest empires on earth, but eventually, Spain's empire crumbled and their power diminished year after year. An obscure conflict, the Spanish Civil War, set the future of modern Spain and allowed the rise and fall of the nationalist Francisco Franco. But did it have to be like this? What if Spain, instead of being a nationalist dictatorship, remained under the control of the Spanish Republicans? Well, today we will ask, what if the Republicans won the Spanish Civil War? After several hundred years, Spain had become a shadow of their former power. Their empire was practically dead, their military was a joke, and the monarchy was immensely unpopular. Starting in the late 19th century, the Spanish monarchy operated a system called El Turno Pacifico. Basically, the Spanish conservatives and liberals would rig and corrupt elections to consolidate power from other political movements. Despite its minor democratic tendencies, the system only worsened the monarchy's unpopularity. The monarchy at the time was led by Alfonso XIII, who oversaw the Spanish-American War and numerous assassination attempts. He became so unpopular that Alfonso agreed to establish a military dictatorship under General Miguel Primo de Rivera in 1923. The change of leadership made the monarchy even more unpopular. Following the end of the dictatorship and a 1931 election, King Alfonso XIII fled the country, and the Second Spanish Republic was peacefully proclaimed. The Constitution of the Second Spanish Republic initiated several democratic reforms, like freedom of press and association, women's rights, and stripping the nobility of their royal status. Citizens elected members of a parliament known as El Cortes, which at the time was made of moderate leftists, moderate rightists, and socialists. However, the new republic's creators began to become hostile towards one another due to issues like foreign policy and status towards the Catholic Church. As the years continued, the country began to splinter, and in 1936, after an election, the country would break out in a civil war between the left and right. The left consisted of communists, socialists, anarchists, syndicalists, regional nationalists, and Republicans working together with the Popular Front. The right consisted of nationalists, monarchists, and conservatives. In July, the Nationalists launched a coup in Spanish Morocco and easily took control under the Army of Africa. They intended to overthrow the government, but fighting broke out in the south and northwest of the mainland, with the military remaining loyal to the Republicans. The Nationalists were stuck in Morocco, and it didn't help when Nationalist leader Jose Sanchero died in a plane crash, which left Francisco Franco as the sole leader of the nationalist movement and removed most of his opposition. While many foreign nations committed to non-interventionism in the Civil War, Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy both hoped to support Franco's nationalist regime and sent supplies and air power to the nationalist cause, which allowed them to arrive on mainland Spain. Republican Spain received support from the Soviet Union, and this allowed hardline communists and anarchists to gain influence in the faction. The war consisted of brutal sieges or battles and immense civilian casualties inflicted by both sides. Thousands of leftists from across the world arrived in Spain to fight for the Republican cause. Eventually, the Nationalists overpowered and cut off the Republicans around 1938. The Popular Front collapsed and anarchists took control, allowing Franco to secure victory for the Nationalists the next year. Despite his victory, the infrastructure and economy of Spain was destroyed. Franco took several years to rebuild the country and stayed out of World War II to achieve it. Starting in the 1950s, Franco started a new government with a movement called the Phalangists, who allowed economic freedom and started a major Spanish economic boom. Spain opened up to the world, and Franco reinstated the monarchy to succeed him after his death in 1975. The new king, Juan Carlos de Bourbon, would actually dismiss Franco's allies and transition the Spanish country back to democracy. Despite resistance and political instability, Juan Carlos insisted on democratic policies and even allowed communist candidates to run in the next Spanish election. Since then, Spain has remained a democratic constitutional monarchy and a notable European state for many decades. What if that changed? What if Spain came under the control of the Republicans after its civil war? Well, in our timeline, the early days of the rebellion were a headache for the Republican Prime Minister Santiago Quiroga. After the course of a few days, he would resign, and the Republicans went through 3 different prime ministers before any military action was taken. This gave the Nationalists the opportunity to not only take military initiative, but gain foreign support. For the first change, after the resignation of Prime Minister Quiroga, let's say the Republicans replace him with someone more competent. For the purpose of this scenario, let's pick Indalecio Prieto, a member of the Spanish Socialist Workers' Party, and at one point, the Minister of Finance and National Defense. Based on his policies, Prieto likely takes more initiative and arms the workers' unions along railroads in the south of Spain. As a result, the Nationalists have a harder time pushing out of Morocco, and with the military and navy loyal to the Republicans, the Nationalists are much less inclined to receive foreign support, especially to transport the Army of Africa. So the Nationalists would still arrive on the mainland, though several months late and at a great disadvantage to the war effort. Our second point of divergence involves Jose Sanchero, who, as previously stated, died in a plane crash shortly after the start of the war. In this alternate timeline, Sanchero never dies and goes on to lead the Nationalist faction in the Civil War. so it's very likely Francisco Franco never rises to become an unopposed leader. If he still tries to take power, the nationalist war effort will suffer from infighting and a lack of unity between the fascist and monarchist forces. As a result, foreign support is extremely limited, but in this timeline, let's say the Germans and Italians don't supply the nationalists in any way as a result of these failures. While this is extremely unlikely, let's say both Germany and Italy just don't commit to the war. On the contrary, Britain and France would have to commit further resources to the Republicans. If the Republicans had maintained a level of cooperation and downplayed the roles of the communist and anarchist movements, both Britain and France could actively support and supply the Republican cause. Whether or not this would cause controversy in their own country's leftist movements is hard to say. In our timeline, the Spanish gold reserves were sold to the Soviet Union, and due to the mismanagement by Republican leaders, the Republicans basically got scammed out of much of their gold. In this alternate timeline, Indalecio Prieto, the former Minister of Finance, would manage the transfer of the Spanish gold reserves to France. From there, the Republicans would purchase weapons and supplies while setting aside gold to be used for the post-war economy. All in all, the Republicans would perform a lot better after these changes. As the conflict continues, the Nationalists continuously lose land, while the Republicans liberate much of Spain. As the conflict continues, the moderate socialists denounce their anti-clerical policies, making it much more likely for them to receive support from the Basque and Catalonian nationalists. By 1938, the nationalists would realize the war was lost, and several leaders would flee to Portugal or Italy. At the same time, the Republican Navy defeats nationalists in Spanish Morocco and liberates the territory, thus bringing the Spanish Civil War to an end with a Republican victory. So following this election, the government would likely hope to hold elections. However, it's probable that an Indalecio Prieto would hold temporary absolute powers to help national unity and reconstruction in the country. From this position, the communists would be able to hold more influence in the post-war government of Spain. The army would remain on high alert, and the NKVD forces in Spain would begin a purge of right-wing groups. Nationalists, monarchists, fascists would all be purged to secure the influence and control of the Spanish government. Despite various advocates, I doubt the Spanish Republicans would follow through with autonomy for the Basque and Catalonian separatists. So as a result, they would continue guerrilla fighting and resistance in those regions, from sabotage to robbery to kidnapping and assassinations. Much of Spain would be affected by this resistance, and the possibility of a second civil war is very likely. In the aftermath, the British and French may begin to distance themselves from Spain out of fear of their own left-wing groups rising up in response. France would give aid and funding to liberal and center-leftist groups in the Popular Front. Meanwhile, the USSR would support communist factions and politicians who support a closer relationship with the Soviet Union. The anarchists and other Marxist groups would fade to obscurity as the socialists and communists would battle for absolute control. In spite of Stalin's influence, Spain would hope to operate on a democratic system and give workers more representation and power, a model similar to that promoted by syndicalists. Stalin would become hostile to the new Workers' Republic, and this increases when the Spanish government condemns the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact made with Germany. Republican Spain is also one of the only European countries that agrees to open its borders to Jewish refugees, who seek asylum in millions to escape Nazi Germany. So how is the rest of Europe affected? Well, the Luftwaffe may have less experience without involvement in the Spanish Civil War, and Italy may be in a better position without spending massive amounts of their money on the nationalist movement. Italy and Germany may have more tensions and prevent the Axis powers from existing, but all in all, I still believe the two countries would align. Portugal, under the dictatorship of Antonio Salazar, would fear the new Spanish government and become much more right-wing, pushing Portugal closer to the Axis than in our timeline. But when the Second World War starts, how is Spain affected? Well, like Spain of our timeline, the Spanish Republic would stay neutral to continue recovering from the damage of the Civil War. In this alternate timeline, the damage would be smaller, but Spain would still be recovering. After the fall of France at the hand of the Nazis, the Republicans are on high alert and begin to send troops to their northern border, hoping to fortify the Pyrenees. In our timeline, the Germans had a plan called Operation Felix to seize the port of Gibraltar and contain access to the Mediterranean, but it never happened since Franco insisted on Spanish neutrality. In this alternate timeline, despite the fact that Gibraltar isn't necessary for a victory, sharing a border with a perceived communist state like Spain would be something that Hitler wouldn't allow. Around early 1941, the Nazis sent two army group corps, led by General Ludwig Kubler and General Rudolf Schmidt, to initiate Operation Felix. The German Luftwaffe would bomb Spanish factories and destroy their capacity to defend themselves. As Germany quickly occupied the north, the issue of supply lines through the Pyrenees would become a burden, causing the German troops to plunder the Spanish countryside. Portugal, under Axis sympathies, would start a presumptive attack on Spain from the west. Spanish Morocco would fall and come under the control of Vichy France. As Spanish forces collapsed, the Nazis carve a puppet state out of much of the east of Spain, and reinstate former nationalist leaders in charge of the Spanish client state. The British also activate Operation Pilgrim, and occupy various Spanish and Portuguese islands in the Atlantic, denying the Germans access to them. Due to heavy partisan activities, the Nazis retain a large military occupation, and the SS regularly keeps Spanish citizens in line. From here, the Allies support Spanish rebels who fight together in a united front against Germany. As Germany invades the Soviet Union, the occupation of Spain will become a further drain on their resources. By 1942, Operation Torch would liberate French North Africa and surround Spain. In our timeline, the Western Allies prepared for an invasion on the Axis weak link of Italy, but in this timeline, a more vulnerable target would be occupied Spain. From here, the British and Americans formulate a plan for an invasion of Spain in collaboration with Spanish rebels. In early 1943, British and American forces cross the Gibraltar Strait and land in mainland Spain. Rebel activity flares up, causing havoc for the German army and destruction of their supply lines. Portugal would quickly switch sides to join the Allies, allowing the Allies to occupy western Spain and liberating the territory. The invasions of Italy and France, slightly delayed, prevented any German reinforcements from stabilizing the front. These invasions and subsequent troop advancements caused the German military deeply on the eastern front. So this leads to a quicker German collapse in our timeline and further military advances by the Soviets and Western Allies, though the borderlines after the war are likely drawn the same as our timeline. In the aftermath of World War II, Spain regains many territories but has to cede their colonies of Morocco and Guinea-Bissau to France. However, Moroccan nationalists are only emboldened by this and begin to rise up against the French. In our timeline, France only granted Morocco independence in 1956, but in this timeline, pressure might force their independence earlier. The Allied forces in Spain would reinstate the Republican government, however meddle with their elections and ensure moderate left-wingers are in power while dismantling and removing the influence of the hardline communists and anarchists. The distance from the Soviet Union would ensure little Soviet influence in their government during the Cold War. During the Marshall Plan, Spain likely agrees to accept nominal amounts of aid to rebuild their country, which still has damage from the Spanish Civil War and World War II. This likely causes a rift between Stalin and Spain, with Stalin condemning their actions. During the East German Uprising, Hungarian Revolution, and an invasion of Czechoslovakia, the Spanish Republic would denounce the USSR and call for more political liberalization across the communist world. Tensions likely simmered down during the first years of Nikita Khrushchev, but that changes with Spain growing closer to the West and their hardline communist movements dying out. Spain will likely have a healthy relationship with Yugoslavia due to both countries splitting off from Soviet influence. It's difficult to tell exactly what politics would be like, but Spain's government would likely commit to reforms such as decentralization and autonomy, as well as a Western approach to foreign policy. Spain would also join the European coal and steel community to reap the economic benefits. By the 1980s and 1990s, the centrists and liberals worked together to take power in Spain. Ultimately, the USSR will still collapse in 1991, and Spain's new government will make it the most democratic it has been in nearly 100 years. The 21st century is hard to predict from here. Will Spain collapse into further political violence? Will they fully embrace capitalism and avoid the fate of the Soviet Union? Comment what you guys think will happen down below, and what other video ideas you want to see. Be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.